On October the 3rd, as preparations were well underway for the invasion and satellite dazing technology had been used by the Sino-Russian coalition to blind American satellites before they were to be hit by hard kill weapons such as the Dongnaeng 2s, 3s, as well as FK-2000s and S-500 anti-satellite systems. These forces rapidly moved to their jumping off points near the border with the USA. As well as occurring in Canada, this was also occurring in Mexico. And here, within the south central sector of the whole invasion, all of the various group armies involved, as well as PAP forces within their second mobile contingents, subordinate units, even a Russian combined arms army within this particular invasion prong, all gathered and prepared as external forces with the full support of two Chinese strategic missile forces brigades in Mexico, the 612th and 613th, in addition to a Trojan brigade, also from the Eastern Theater Command, as well as the two aforementioned, the 616th Strategic Missile Forces Brigade, deep in eastern Texas. The Chinese were not the only forces to contribute cruise and tactical ballistic missiles. Also was the 950th Rocket Brigade within the 2nd Combined Arms Army of Russia, beginning on CCP properties in and around the San Antonio area, in addition to an Iranian brigade from the IRGC Aerospace Forces, the 7th Al-Hadid Brigade, hailing from Karaj in Iran, their home base, having recently been deployed to Mexico for their participation in the invasion. As this brigade was tasked with firing Shahab 1s and 2s, although for this operation they would be exclusively firing the Shahab 2 with its longer range. There was even an Iranian missile unit within this particular area, the M1ssile Missile Regiment, which is slightly off the map in a different invasion sector, although it would contribute to within this invasion sector by firing its moderate-ranged Babur terrain-hugging subsonic cruise missiles to assist its forces, Trojan forces, operating within the Albuquerque region, along with their Iranian counterparts of the 3rd Iranian Armor Brigade. The 18th Pakistani Infantry Brigade would be rapidly seizing the Albuquerque metro area, along with the Air Force installation present in that particular battle space. There was also, just to the north in a neighboring AO, a Russian combined arms army, the 8th, operating within the battle space of northern New Mexico and Santa Fe area, as well as portions of southern Colorado, as this combined arms army was dispersed insofar as its subunits were concerned. However, even as the enormous invasion prongs were getting prepared to advance through Texas, insofar as it related to the 3 largest of the invasion prongs, including in the last sub-series of this documentary, the PAP elements of the 4th Corps that were supporting the enormous invasion prong just to their south, up I-35 of Group Armies 7 through 13, there would be a massive battle to be fought over the El Paso / Fort Bliss area. Although this far westernmost invasion prong would be the smallest of all 4 present by far, operating within this area would still constitute perhaps the biggest battle along the border, not in terms of the size of the forces involved, although due to there being an active U.S. Army base in this particular sector of border, this would be an enormous battle simply because, in addition to that being Fort Bliss being a massive installation of regular active Army forces for the Americans, these coalition forces operating in this specific area would be extremely well equipped in terms of the sheer volume of cruise and ballistic missiles that would be fired, in addition to the high-tech equipment of the 14th PLA Group Army. Although it was a reserve PLA Group Army, it was one of the far best equipped of the reserve forces, as the PLA had an enormous ready reserve to draw forces from and mobilized all of them for this invasion insofar as it related to their reserves, as well as using a large proportion of their active PLA units. This 14th PLA Group Army, that notwithstanding relating to the active units, was extremely well equipped with some of the newest and most advanced hardware that the PLA had available. Alongside of them would be operating a PAP unit of the PAP's 4th Corps of the 2nd Mobile Contingent, the 18th PAP Light Armored Brigade. They would have full cruise and tactical ballistic missile support from not only their own heavily reinforced brigades of their strategic missile forces, they would also have ample missile support from a Russian squadron of 8 Tu-95 strategic bomber aircraft, which in the capacity of a bomber aircraft, the Tu-95's newest iteration, the M1ssile version, was essentially a gigantic flying standoff missile launching platform. Also, there would be 2 Russian squadrons of ground attack / fighter aircraft within this area. One squadron being of MiG-31Ks armed with ground attack munitions, including the much vaunted m1ssile or KH-47 hypersonic air-fired ballistic missile, as it could maneuver in random patterns towards its target, making it a true hypersonic weapon. The other squadron was among some of Russia's most advanced in terms of fighter aircraft, being the Su-57 stealth fighter, a multi-role fighter aircraft, although primarily tasked with air support during this enormous undertaking. Although there were many different coalition fighter, ground attack, and even other bomber aircraft from Russia themselves as well as China, both having enormous strategic bomber fleets, the Russians would be firing their standoff cruise missiles, the KH-55s and KH-101 stealth cruise missiles, both subsonic cruise missiles but very long range, due to the fact that just in case the 11th Air Defense Artillery Brigade, also likewise stationed at Fort Bliss, was able to get any shots off, they did not want to put their very important strategic bomber aircraft at risk, hence the need for standoff missiles in this particular sector of the much larger invasion. As SEAD operations, or suppression of enemy air defense, would take the absolute highest priority within this invasion sector, as there were several installations in the entire south central invasion sector that boasted air defense capabilities, one being Fort Hood, another Fort Sill, and Fort Bliss, all combined offering a sort of triangular lane insofar as the coverage, although the coverage was minimal from where the systems were currently deployed, they would ostensibly, in an ideal situation, force invading aircraft to fly in specific lanes between the coverage where they could be ideally intercepted by fighter aircraft dedicated to the role of air superiority and therefore engaged by them. However, due to the tandem anti-satellite strike combined with the cyber strike, with the anti-satellite strike, this would extremely nullify the fighting capacity of the Americans, totally leaving them deaf, dumb, and blind, in addition to local superiority in electronic warfare, with China and Russia each boasting the most advanced electronic warfare systems to date, including electromagnetic jamming, where they could isolate the point of origin of certain signals and completely shut off various systems using this type of platform. KG-600 jamming pods being one such implement operated by the PLA, which was fully capable of this as an electromagnetic electronic warfare jamming weapon. Of course, there were also traditional systems employed meant to jam radar and radio signals, but primarily these electronic warfare platforms served as an ideal way to shut off redundant communication systems and portable radars that were not connected to the internet, nor were they dependent on satellite, as they were local radar stations that were portable and generator powered and directly connected to certain weapon systems for targeting capabilities. Therefore, these electronic warfare platforms operated by the PLA and the Russian armed forces were indispensable in the role of dealing with these adversaries and these types of equipment that they operated, such as Patriot system radars, for instance. These were absolutely necessary to destroy, along with the actual Patriot batteries themselves, as well as the THAAD batteries located on this installation, being the Fort Bliss installation, which is adjacent to the White Sands missile range. Due to the heightened tensions around the world, as was the case in the previous battle videos, and the Sino-Russian naval drills occurring off of both coasts of the country simultaneously as pre-planned months ago by the Chinese and Russians to make the Americans think that this would just be some sort of standard intimidation naval drill off their own coasts. These served as the screen from which the invasion forces would gather along both borders, as well as in landing craft of different types insofar as the coastal landing, as far as the paratroopers landing deep inland as external forces to reinforce local Trojans, like such as occurred in Colorado, a whole separate theater of the invasion. The other method of screening these movements to their jumping off points throughout Mexico and Canada and elsewhere were the satellite dazing technologies used by both China and Russia, who each had the capability to utilize such in order to blind satellites and obscure them from seeing entire areas, such as primarily Mexico and Canada, is where they focused their technologies in this regard, only allowing American satellites to see what was occurring inside their own country, which was occurring before the Trojans even got their muster call, as well as seeing what was occurring off both coasts. As the Trojans would get their muster call, they would quickly and quietly go to their CCP regime purchased and owned and strategically located and bought properties and prepare within their units for the invasion by doing vehicle maintenance in all the hidden locations where vehicles were stored, such as many meters long greenhouses which in multiple rows on farms could disguise entire armored battalions or air defense battalions or artillery battalions as these white greenhouse type structures on multiple farms, all located throughout the nation, normally were ordinary greenhouses that served to cover plants so that during inclement weather or in the wintertime, they could continue to obtain UV lighting and keep them growing year-round. Whereas on the CCP properties, these served as just one of many different camouflage types to hide Chi-Com, Russian, and their allies' vehicles on their CCP properties purchased by the Chinese CCP regime. Within this battle, on the far western corner, on the far western end of the South Central Invasion sector, this would truly be a massive battle indeed, although again, not nearly in terms of the size of personnel as the 370,000 man invasion prong going up I-35 or the other 320,000 invasion prongs going up from the far south and from the western air edge of Texas at the New Mexico and El Paso far west point of Texas. These forces numbered some roughly 80,000 when combining the PLA and PAP and Pakistani 14th Infantry Division, which was the local Trojan unit already beginning on CCP properties within the country, as China would let their allies use their CCP properties as staging areas for their units as well within southern New Mexico here in order to carry out their own given tasks as per the invasion plan as it related to essentially cutting off the American Armed Forces from Interstate 25, where it connected to Interstate 10 at Las Cruces, was a vital road junction that had to be held at all costs for the external forces of the 14th PLA Group Army and 18th PAP Light Armored Brigade to proceed into the north to reinforce local Trojans in the northern New Mexico and southern Colorado AOs, as this particular invasion prong, being the smallest, also had the least bit of distance that it needed to travel insofar as it related to where it had to go and which Trojans that they had to reinforce. Of course, next door to the west, in the far western New Mexico and Arizona portion of the invasion, there were other prongs of other group armies and allies, as well as in California, there was another invasion prong that was equally as massive as the invasion prong into the south central sector, as California was a very highly populated state and therefore needed ample forces to properly subdue, as it, like Texas, contained multiple military installations that likewise needed to be subdued, as well as the local population. Going to the local map, the forces of the 14th PLA Group Army were dispersed along the Rio Grande River border with the far westernmost point of Texas, as well as its Special Operations Battalion temporarily being posted at the exact border corner with Mexico, Texas, and New Mexico, with the entire 18th PAP Light Armored Brigade being posted just to the west of the Stalking Leopard Special Operations Battalion, like many other Chinese Special Operations Battalions with illustrious names, many being named after a tiger with an adjective or a leopard with an adjective. There are even bird-based, or named rather, Special Operations Forces like Falcon and Eagle related. This one being a leopard named Special Operations Forces, the Stalking Leopard Special Operations Forces of the PLA's 14th Group Army. Again, this being a reserve group army, but one of the reserve group armies that was just as well equipped as a regular PLA group army. As equipment was proliferated and reserve units began to get top of the line brand new equipment as more and more of specific vehicle types and items and weapons were produced, this group army was one of the group armies that was equipped as such. The 14th Infantry Division of the 48th Infantry Division of the 14th PLA Group Army was a fairly large formation of just over 16,000 troops. There was also the 141st Aviation Regiment, who itself had 3 battalions of helicopters, one being an attack helicopter battalion, another an armed reconnaissance battalion, and another a transportation battalion, with the first 2 armed with attack and armed reconnaissance helicopters respectively, with the attack helicopters being the Z-19 attack helicopters, a very modern, very potent attack helicopter, with the armed reconnaissance being the Z-11W WA attack helicopters, and the transport helicopters being a combination of Z-8 companies and Z-20 companies comprising it, of those utility helicopter types. It had an independent headquarters battalion, an independent security battalion for ground security operations in their installation or landing zone, or LZ, wherever they were operating from, as well as a support company. These were all independent companies, not part of any of the aforementioned battalions, with the HQ company encapsulating the regiment's command elements, with the separate support company in basically coordinating the logistical activities with the ground security company guarding these aviation assets wherever they were operating from. There was also the 14th Signals Regiment. Now this was the element responsible not just for signals and intercepts or intelligence and communications, or even an ELINT battalion responsible for electronic intelligence gathering and communications. It had an electronic warfare battalion dedicated to the electronic warfare role, which was responsible for jamming radio and radar. The headquarters company was an independent headquarters company, and it had an independent support company as well within the regiment. There was also an Air Defense Artillery Regiment, the 14th Air Defense Artillery Regiment. This consisted of 3 battalions of advanced medium to longer range air defense, with again a independent headquarters company and support battalion for its logistics. These specific air defense artillery battalions boasted the HQ-16 for short to medium range air defense, with another being an HQ-22 battalion, and its other battalion being an HQ-12 battalion for shorter range air defense. So this was essentially a layered air defense artillery regiment, which could provide short, medium, and long range air defense artillery. These were all some of the most advanced air defense systems available. Russia, as well as China, likewise had incredibly advanced air defense systems as well as electronic warfare systems. Both nations shared that attribute. Providing the heaviest punch of the 14th Group Army was its 144th Armored Division. This armored division consisted of Type 99A main battle tanks, one of the most advanced battle tanks in the entire world, if not the most advanced battle tank in the entire world. Also, it consisted of its own armored infantry battalions within the armored brigade, as well as an artillery, or two artillery battalions of self-propelled artillery, PLZ 05 155 millimeter self-propelled guns in 2 battalions, as well as 2 dedicated anti-tank battalions. Now, these anti-tank battalions were armed with the very potent AFT-10 longer-range anti-tank systems, whereas at the armored battalions company level of an anti-tank company in each armored battalion, as opposed to the anti-tank battalions that were configured in a similar way to the 5th Anti-Tank Brigade, which took part in the McAllen, Texas battle earlier covered. At the company level of the anti-tank company in each tank battalion or armored battalion was the brand new QN 506 anti-tank vehicle. These vehicles were extremely well armed and bristling with various different weapons, as well as even rails for firing loitering munitions, and even in their own quadcopter reconnaissance drone. These had the capability to be remotely or semi-autonomously piloted or with a driver/gunner. These would be manned, of course, as having human operators gave certain advantages that would be difficult when remote piloting these vehicles in combat. The 148th Artillery Brigade was equipped with the PHL-81 multiple launch rocket systems, which were essentially a 122 millimeter MLRS, as well as the PHL-03 300 millimeter longer range rocket artillery system, which were devastating, each in their own battalions. There were also 2 battalions of towed PLL-01 155 millimeter howitzers and 3 battalions of towed PLL-66 towed 152 millimeter howitzers, and of course the headquarters and support battalion, encapsulating the command and support elements of the brigade. This brigade likewise packed an incredible punch insofar as a artillery brigade was concerned, with 4 different systems at its disposal: the 152 and 155 millimeter howitzers, which were relatively heavy shells, along with the 122 millimeter multiple launch rocket systems and the PHL-03 multiple launch rocket systems, which were large. China had the longest range 300 millimeter rocket system in the world, the A300, although these only equipped, for the time being, active PLA units until even more could be produced and proliferated. Insofar as it related to the PAP forces, one of their few light armored brigades belonging to the 2nd Mobile Contingent, who had a decent handful of such units of light armored brigades that were all tracked, committed their 18th Light Armored Brigade to this particular sector of operations, consisting of Type 62G light tanks, which were highly upgraded from their original iteration on their second version of a fire control system, being an upgrade from the original Marconi copy that the Chinese originally had put in during the later stages of the Cold War, having had upgraded it once more before passing it down to reserve PLA light units or to the PAP, as well as Type 86G infantry fighting vehicles and Type 63 armor personnel carriers that equipped the armored infantry forces, as this entire unit didn't use any wheeled armor personnel carriers or infantry fighting vehicles such as the WZ-551, although standard PAP forces generally did. It had its own artillery battalion, similar to the artillery battalion, or similar to the artillery regiment, and its configuration of its battalions that took place at the Dolores/Penitas Ranchos Penitas battle, just in the neighboring northern battle space of the large Group Army 7 to 13 advance prong. This PAP force would be entrusted with advancing deep inland and spearheading the part of the attack into New Mexico itself along the western bank of the Rio Grande River, while on the eastern bank of the Rio Grande River, already inside of America, was the Trojan shock unit consisting of the Pakistani Army's 14th Infantry Division and its various subcomponents, all beginning on CCP regime properties and striking out immediately at their main target, which was the installation and the forces upon Fort Bliss, which would need to be taken rapidly and immediately. Their entire purpose in this operation was to cordon and sweep Fort Bliss, as well as preventing any of its units from escaping or heading towards the interstate junction at Las Cruces, which could potentially be a temporary hindrance holding up the timing of the operation, as these external forces of these PLA and PAP troops would need to seize the interstate route of advance and move rapidly up the interstate. All in all, this entire battle would only last a relatively short amount of time, shorter than the battles that would occur on the border at precisely the same exact time when the invasion kicked off. This battle would only last 5.5 hours, whereas other battles would last a bit longer, typically 6 to 7 hours longer, or 6 to 7 hours in totality, which would be half an hour or an hour and a half longer than this battle. The reason this battle would be so short in duration is because these forces combined were highly potent, like a sledgehammer, as far as the Tu-95s and the volley of 128 cruise missiles they would launch from farther away before flying over the area to return to base, as well as the strike aircraft of the MiG-31Ks and firing their Kinzhals and KH-58 radar-seeking missiles, which could seek out any ground vehicle that had a radio set within it, as these were anti-radiation missiles and could not only seek radars, but any type of communication set, such as a radio, and would use these to great effect against American ground vehicles, as many of these American units were called to a higher readiness status and were out in the training areas training with live ammunition at the time of the invasion, as it was to kick off, with others already having had maintained their vehicles within their own motor pool's maintenance bays preparing them for operations out in the field in the training areas, although one entire brigade of the 1st Armored Division would end up being diverted into El Paso itself to try to hold the line near the interstate as Chi-Com forces of the 48th Infantry Division would be crossing the border in force. The various Helo-borne forces of the 141st Aviation Regiment would likewise be seeing ample action during this specific battle of the much larger invasion campaign, as the 141st Aviation Regiment would not only be flying its entire transport battalion of helos to pick up the companies of the Stalking Leopard Spec Ops and transport them to conduct a classic Spec Ops mission, which would be to capture a high-value target by dropping them off at an isolated landing zone before returning to their CCP base within Mexico near Juarez. This, in order to capture a known militia leader, as intel from intel analysts had been pieced together on high-value targets as part of the larger invasion operation, and various decks of cards, similar to the card decks as it related to the Iraq invasion, depicted high-value targets for the regime. Well, these specific decks of cards for the invasion into America depicted high-value targets in each and every of the 50 states. This militia leader, as there were armed militias within this region of the country, as they were in South Texas and other parts of Texas, they organized in the same manner due to the same reasons as the failed border policies, and felt the need, the urgent, desperate need to rapidly arm and organize themselves into some type of cohesive fighting force to protect their local communities and region against armed criminal elements or other types of rogue elements from coming across the border and causing enormous problems within their region. Well, due to this, and due to the possibility of this militia leader potentially becoming a thorn in the side of the occupation forces post-invasion, there was a special operations mission put together to not just liquidate the entire militia force, but to apprehend and capture the leader of this force as well, as this leader was a well-known militia leader. He stayed in a compound in a mountainous area of New Mexico as the Rocky Mountains bisected the region, as terrain would play a major role in this particular battle, as the Rio Grande was flanked by the Rocky Mountain ranges. Although these weren't the highest ranges in the Rockies, which were often found in Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana, these were still part of the mountains in general, and there were ample places from which to hide and ambush occupation forces. Therefore, it was incumbent upon the invading forces to quickly and efficiently neutralize these types of threats, so that partisan elements could not be organized by well-known leaders in their specific communities or areas. Hence, again, the need to capture the leadership and decapitate the leadership of not only civilian militia-type forces, but also political and military leadership, as certainly the commanders of the forces on Fort Bliss were likewise considered to be HVTs, as were paramilitary commanders of the local border and customs paramilitary forces, all of which were wanted alive or otherwise. Therefore, the invaders made sure to pass out these decks of cards to every ordinary soldier so that they could familiarize themselves with the names and faces of these specific high-value individuals, in order that if they came across them in some way, shape, or form, that they could apprehend them and therefore neutralize any potential perils to their future occupation. As the battle would break out, the Tu-95s, flying from further away, crossing the border by Big Bend in Texas and firing their huge salvo of 128 cruise missiles, 100 of which would be meant for Fort Bliss, with the other 28 going much further north to aid their forces in the northern New Mexico region, fighting up there of their 8th Combined Arms Army. These Tu-95 MSM versions would jettison their munitions, fly in an arc over the battle space, and return to base, while many waves of coalition aircraft would be flying in further north, while other waves of coalition aircraft were given their designated battle spaces, or AOs, according to the forces they were designated to support. As it related to this border area, that was this one Tu-95 squadron of 8 strategic bombers and the squadron of MiG-31K strike aircraft and Su-57 stealth fighters. There would be waves of Chinese, even Pakistani, and other Russian aircraft flying further to the north to other zones of the invasion to support Trojans operating in Albuquerque, Santa Fe, and even in Colorado. The invasion was set to kick off at midnight everywhere for the Trojans and for the externals crossing the border. 2 different components with 2 different missions. The Pakistani 14th Infantry Division would originate at their CCP properties and go straight for the jugular, as would all the missile strikes from the Shahab-2s fired by the 7th Al-Hadid IRGC Aerospace Forces Missile Brigade, located to the south and off the map with their Shahab-2s, while the Pakistani 176 Missile Regiment, firing the Babur cruise missiles located in the adjacent battle space, would be firing over this battle space to support their own forces operating further to the north in Albuquerque, as it was not necessary for them to fire a cruise missile with that type of range into such a short area from where they were currently positioned. The Chinese missile forces of their local within Mexico, 2 heavily reinforced brigades from their strategic missile forces, were hundreds of miles away, closer to Big Bend in Texas, but they were strategically positioned from a point to where the missiles with the types of range they fired could hit targets even deeper into America, even from where they sat, just across the Rio in Mexico, across from Big Bend State Park, or National Park, rather. Big Bend was a fairly sparsely populated area, and therefore there was no need to really send any forces across that part of the river, as many canyons constituted the edges of that river, so the terrain was too rough for vehicle crossings in most areas, and the population was extremely light and sparse. Therefore, the nearest invasion prongs were separated by hundreds of miles. The prong in western Texas and the prong going up through New Mexico. Hundreds of miles separated them. But there were already Trojans in West Texas anyhow, by Midland and Odessa, a fairly populated metropolitan area in western Texas. And of course, the Trojans in El Paso, being the 14th Pakistani Infantry Division. Most of their forces began in and around Las Cruces, El Paso proper, and also Alamogordo, all strategically located as per the strategically purchased CCP properties, where their units had been building up for many years alongside of their Chinese and Russian counterparts for this very day. When the clock struck midnight, the anti-satellite strikes occurred with the cyber attacks in tandem, along with the electronic warfare beginning to inundate entire areas of over 100 miles in circumference, pinpointing the origin of signals of enemy units and jamming them. The Russian heavy bombers again fired their munitions, as did the MiG-31Ks, even the Su-57s, mostly armed with air-to-air munitions, but they carried a few air-to-ground payloads, each carrying a 500-pound, or a pair of 500-pound munitions, air-to-ground, laser-guided. All began to strike their targets simultaneously, along with the Iranian-fired, TEL-fired Shahab 2s, along with Chinese-fired DF missiles of different series. There was also DH missiles fired, such as the DH-10As, which were a subsonic Chinese cruise missile fired from a TEL system, but there were the more powerful tactical ballistic missiles of different types fired as well. And even the Chinese fired a hypersonic system in this engagement, being the DF-100 cruise missile, specifically targeting the air defense elements stationed at Fort Bliss for the SEAD operations, or suppression of enemy air defenses, as that was the absolute most vital mission to occur at the absolute beginning of the invasion, as that, for this battle, was priority number one, eliminating the enemy's air defenses, as they did not want a single coalition aircraft swatted down out of the sky, due to having not properly ensured the destruction of any ground-based air defense systems. Just as they were destroying the American Air Force on the ground literally within the first hours, so too was the air defense likewise destroyed. Various Russian, Chinese, Iranian, and in other areas, Pakistani, and even Belarusian fired tactical ballistic missiles, as the Belarusians committed their only missile brigade to the fight, being the 465th Missile Brigade. Its tactical missile brigade of Iskanders, as well as North Korean missiles fired, as these 5 nations mentioned, being China, Russia, Iran, Pakistan, Belarus, with North Korea being the 6th, all had contributed missile forces to the invasion. These also being the largest coalition members as a whole in terms of the forces contributed, with obviously China contributing the lion's share due to the simply gargantuan size of its paramilitary and the enormous size of its military with its entire ready reserve force, with Russia being the second largest contributor of forces, followed by Pakistan, Iran, Belarus, and North Korea being the 4 next biggest contributing nations, with a whole host of Latin American nations, even some African nations, and even other Middle Eastern nations and entities contributing their own expeditionary forces, comprising the 500,000 in size Foreign Expeditionary Army, which, in addition to the Chinese and Russian forces, which operated together but independently as far as the command structures, but interwoven, constituted the entire invasion force. All of the coalition knew the battle plan. They all coordinated their actions together. Of course, because so many different nations were operating together, there were minor mishaps, but nothing that derailed any major part of the invasion. As many of the largest contributors to the invasion itself were all very close allies, especially as it pertained to China, Pakistan, North Korea, and Russia were very, very strong, avid allies of China and worked extremely well with China. In terms of Pakistan, or even Iran as well, in terms of Pakistan, China had modernized their military industry. And although the forces of Pakistan were essentially comprised of forces that essentially had gigantic stocks of American weapons, they likewise had gigantic stocks of Chinese weapons, as during the Cold War, from the middle of the Cold War up until the 90s, Pakistan had purchased massive numbers of American vehicles and weapon systems before turning to China for military modernization, as now Pakistan either licensed, produced, or exclusively bought Chinese-made arms. Their Al-Khalid main battle tank is actually nothing more than the Chinese Type 90-II main battle tank, or 2 in Roman numerals, which was renamed the Al-Khalid in Pakistani service. This highly modern main battle tank was originally purchased from China, but now licensed produced as the Al-Khalid in the modernized manufacturing plants of Taxala, the manufacturer of the Al-Khalid, or Taxila, the manufacturer of the Al-Khalid main battle tank, as well as other weapons platforms operated by the Pakistanis, all with the help of Chinese engineers and other industry specialists in order to advance their own military technology. Same goes for aircraft, as Pakistan also, like China, flies the JF-17 and is now beginning to license produce it itself, a 4.5 generation multi-role fighter aircraft. During this fighting, there would be urban combat within El Paso, a fairly large city with a fairly large population, as well as fighting within the installation itself, which would also be highly blanketed by howitzer and rocket artillery, as well as various cruise and ballistic missiles, and even to an extent air-dropped munitions of the laser-guided or free-fall varieties. And there would also be combat in the mountains against the armed civilian militias. There would even be combat in the desert by forces of the PAP, Light Armor Brigade, while the heaviest forces of the 144th Armored Division would ride straight to the interstate of I-25 before leading the externals, the entire 14th PLA Group Army and 18th PAP Light Armor Brigade up the interstate, this invasion route, to assist the Trojans deeper inland. The next video will begin to explore the different aspects of this large battle as multiple events literally occurred simultaneously throughout the battle, from the crossing of the troops of the 48th Infantry Division under the fire of not only their own artillery, but also the artillery fire from the 148th Artillery Brigade, as well as the PAP's own artillery battalion firing in support of their armored forces of light tanks and armored infantry advancing across the desert into New Mexico. And we'll also explore the Special Operations mission, a vital one at that, in order to secure not just an area adjacent to a main invasion and supply route, but also to ensure that for a long time to come, this area and its civilian population would not have any type of leader to rally around as far as it related to armed resistance as partisans against the occupation. Or at least that was their hope in conducting this high-value target apprehension with their special operations forces. And the Trojan shock forces in this area, the 14th Pakistani Infantry Division, cordoning and striking deep into the American installation with their own artillery supporting their actions, as well as preventing even a breakout from the installation in one sector of the fighting along its perimeter, at its training area, as well as within a portion of the White Sands missile range. Unlike other battles occurring at the border, many of which involved a small handful of National Guard elements, these active duty Army elements were at a far higher state of readiness, being that they were adjacent to the border. Although one issue that would haunt them would be that they had some of their subordinate units normally at the post deployed to other areas, some for training and some due to overseas missions in other nations, as by this point in time, America still had overseas commitments and tiny garrisons in places that it ought not be at, and definitely could have used these forces to better effect at home, even though the anti-satellite strike, cyber attack, and electronic warfare systems essentially castrated these forces in terms of their capabilities. However, even so, the sheer type of equipment wielded by these units still created the conditions for a very intense fight, as all of these units, in addition to the paramilitary elements and the armed civilians, whether that was the border and customs paramilitary on the border itself at its different outposts, or whether it was the armed civilian militias or reactionary civilians inside of the city, or the military units themselves, fighting would be heavy in this area, as even though the active army units, again, were highly nullified in their capabilities, losing their ISR capabilities immediately, as well as their communications, the vehicles they possessed were still able to return fire in many instances and would cause some casualties among the invaders. Although compared to the types of casualties the invaders themselves would inflict, ultimately what the Americans could do was little to nothing in the grand scheme of it all. However, at the most local of levels, the units that experienced casualties would never forget any of that, as they would lose some comrades, which would make it personal to them, while at the larger level, being that the casualties were ultimately so small, it wouldn't be noticed by the command, as none of their units would be mauled in a way that would make them even a little bit combat ineffective, as the losses would be generally only a small handful of vehicles and troops dispersed among a large element of forces. Again, a grand total of 80,000 invasion forces in just this sector between the Trojan and external elements operating in concert to smash their way into the land in order to reinforce up the highway Trojan units that are deeper inland, such as the 8th Combined Arms Army of Russia and other Trojans even further north in Colorado. This, as additional different Trojans would be operating to the north of them, along with externals from Canada moving down through the northern states to meet around the northern Colorado area, as the Trojans from Mexico would end up in southern and central Colorado, as it related to this prong here, as the units would disperse upon spreading out. This was a massive invasion with many forces involved, with in excess of 1.6 million just operating in this one invasion sector alone, with 3.5 million total coming up through Mexico, another 3.5 million coming down from Canada, and 5 million Trojans in their respective units scattered throughout the country, and 500,000 beach landing forces. This 12.5 million strong invasion force would be the largest invasion in the history of humanity. 3 times the size of Operation Barbarossa, which up until this invasion was still the largest invasion in history. In the next video, the battle initiates, and all the various subcomponents of the battle will be analyzed in great detail.